This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Merci Fabrice, merci Francisca. My French is horribly rusty, so I apologise in advance that I will be speaking this evening in English. I have not been back to Paris for a couple of years, and it's a long time since I worked on the Capital Cities at War project, where I was exercising my linguistic skills a little bit more, although even on my best day my accent is truly offensive, awful, and I don't really want to inflict that on you. The last Great War was, if I'm honest, a rather accidental book. I never consciously set out to write it. It rather emerged from 5 elements that after a while I began to realise were interconnecting. The first element, and this is truly ancient history, was a conference paper that I delivered at the Histoire de la Grande Guerre in Péronne in 1994, and saying that makes me feel very, very old. I've just passed 50. And this conference paper was one paper in an international conference looking at reactions to the outbreak of the First World War. It was very much a conference that had been called in honour of Jean-Jacques Becker, and in response to his work on how France entered into the First World War, and the realisation that at that stage in the early 1990s the equivalent stories had not been written about many European nations, and most conspicuously, from my point of view, about Britain. So I started looking, really probably for the first time amongst any serious historian, okay, what do we really know about the British public mood late July, early August 1914? And what I found surprised me, which was that the received wisdom about how the British entered into the war, a narrative of naive enthusiasm, really had very little support from the contemporary primary evidence. So I tried to write about what I felt was a much more complicated story about British entry into the war. So that was the first element that fed into this book. The second element was a postdoctoral project on propaganda. I was a junior research fellow at King's College, Cambridge, for 4 years. When I was appointed to that post, I told them I was going to write a book on propaganda. It has still never happened. But quite a lot of the research and thinking I did for that book did feed into this book instead, and in particular the second chapter of this book. The third element that fed into this was my involvement in a project headed by Jay Winter and Jean-Louis Robert on capital cities at war. And I agreed to write a chapter on religious sites and practices, conducting the archival and primary research on Britain, but also trying to pull this together in the comparative synthesis. Now, once again, what happened was that I ended up doing far more research than I could actually use in that article. And being a thrifty soul, I felt that I should probably try and recycle it. The fourth contributory element was, again, something that I was asked to do, which was to write a piece for an edited collection of work by Oxford historians. By this stage I'd moved to Oxford. So an edited collection which Josie Harris was putting together on concepts of civil society. And for that collection, I began to look at military service tribunals. These had largely been misunderstood and neglected in the existing historiography. Almost everything that had been written about military service tribunals had centred on the issue of conscientious objection. And again, what I found once I started looking at the records was that conscientious objection represented a tiny proportion of the overall work of these tribunals. Interesting, significant, but nevertheless it had overshadowed a much wider story about British society at war and the distribution of sacrifice. Which led me back into a reconsideration of my first work, which was on the memory of war in Britain and the ways in which the First World War had been constructed in the 1920s and 30s through commemorative ritual, centering around, and I've used the word and it won't be the last time I use it this evening, the concept of sacrifice and the significance of sacrifice. And it became clear that all of these little projects actually, in important respects, connected together. And at this point, I started thinking perhaps what I really need to do is write a book that ties these things. There was also another, I think, specific influence, which was envy, really. It was envy of the existence, actually, of Jean-Jacques Becquer's book on the Great War and the French People, which is a book I love, and the absence of such a book about Britain. Now, in some ways, another book that I'm a great admirer of, Trevor Wilson's huge doorstep, The Myriad Faces of War, provided something of the sort, but it was a very different sort of book, and it was much less of a social history. And coming from a sort of social historian's background, I wanted to get to a much greater degree at the mentalities of ordinary people, rather than being tied to the higher narratives of political machinations, which of course is Trevor Wilson's background as a political historian, or indeed the extensive military narratives. And of course it is worth remembering that the British military history of the First World War was being substantially rewritten during the 1990s and early part of this century. So the idea of a book began to take shape. There was a further context, and it was only when I was starting to write some notes for this I became fully aware of this, but which has become clear to me in retrospect. And I think this was what was happening in Britain between the late 1990s and 2008 in terms of foreign policy. And this book probably also in some ways represents a reflection on what now looks like the distant era of liberal interventionism. And I think there's an interesting double edge to that, because in the process of pulling the book together and writing the book, I became very aware that idealism and terrible consequences are in fact entirely compatible. That you can have the highest of motivations and the most terrible of outcomes. And again, I think that came through quite explicitly, actually, in my concluding remarks in this book about the horrible paradox that it's not always the worst things about human nature that lead us into wars. It can actually be some of the better things. And yet, look what happens. And I think that was the paradox I found myself addressing throughout this book, and which felt like a very real and immediate issue in Britain, particularly I think between 2003 and 2008. the recognition that actually you might be trying to do good, but you might end up doing things that are both not necessarily in the national interest, but also more morally dubious than you would want them to be. The degree to which wars can take on their own dynamic outside of the control of the people who initiate them. So that, I think, is how the book came to be. And then in a very practical sense, my very messy manuscript, and it started out as being probably 25 to 30% longer than the one that eventually was produced. I'd more or less despaired of bringing it into any kind of conclusion, and then my colleague, Professor Hugh Strawn, more or less pulled my arm behind my back, forced me to submit it to Cambridge University Press, and made sure that the thing actually happened. And I'm eternally grateful for Hugh for pushing me into actually submitting the manuscript to a publisher, which I hadn't quite brought myself to be able to do. So that's how the book came to be written. What are the arguments of the book? Well, the first argument, which I've already touched on, was that war enthusiasm was an inadequate framework for understanding the British public reaction to the outbreak of the war, and that the idea of war enthusiasm rested on a simplistic understanding of mass psychology and several generations of repetition of cliches about how the British had gone to war, which were not supported by the contemporary evidence. In other words, the idea of enthusiasm in 1914 is to a large extent a creation of the period after 1918. We'll probably again return to that. The second argument of the book was that the history of wartime propaganda had equally been distorted, that the invention of false atrocity stories, which was taken as the typical behaviour of British propagandists, was, first of all, not actually initially central to the way in which consent for the war was created and sustained. And, pushing a little further, the idea of maliciously invented atrocity propaganda was itself largely a creation of interwar pacifist propaganda. In other words, our ideas of what British propaganda during the war were are much more a creation of the 1920s than of what was actually occurring in 1914, 1915. I also wanted to put much more stress on the way that ideas about atrocities come up from the general population rather than being deliberate inventions of manipulative press barons or people working in government agencies. And I became very interested in the specific significance of rumour as something that generates ideas about atrocities. Finally, I argue that hatred of the Germans, and it is primarily about the Germans in terms of the Central Powers, but that hatred of the Germans did not come to the fore through propaganda, but much more through reflections on verifiable military activity. In other words, it's the way that Germany fights the war that plays the biggest role in creating a hatred of the Germans in Britain. Now, some of this is to do with the particular maritime nature of British society. So, German submarine warfare has a particular resonance in the British case. But it's also to do with things like Zeppelin raids, it's to do with the bombardment of East Coast towns by German battleships, which are constructed into an image which intensifies during 1915 of German barbarism. And I would argue that these things are probably much more important in generating hatred in Britain than stories about Belgium. Not that those are entirely insignificant. I think they are significant, but I don't think it's as central as these particular reflections on German methods of fighting war. The third argument, which takes up the central chapters of the book, was about the centrality of volunteerism in the British war effort in the early years of the war, in line with the traditions of a liberal state. But there is also the increasing realisation of what economists would call a free rider problem. That a voluntary war effort tended to create tensions over the prospect of other people in society failing to do their bit. And so the movement towards compulsion in all sorts of aspects of British wartime society is driven at least as much by concepts of equity as it is by simply the desire to expand state power. This connects together in what I describe as the economy of sacrifice. And then this leads in to the fourth argument, that in understanding where that economy of sacrifice comes from, it's important to address the fact that this is a society where Christianity remained a profound influence on all social classes, and that this was that understanding this is necessary to understanding the idea of redemptive sacrifice as a fundamental driver of British society during the war. This in turn led into another connected argument, that our thinking about the nature of class relations in what is, after all, an incredibly class-divided society, that our thinking about the nature of class relations in wartime should be reconfigured to take into account these ideas of economy of sacrifice. And that during the second half of the war, the organised working class resorted increasingly to strikes and to the threat of strikes in order to restore what they saw as a fair balance after their living standards had declined in the first half of the war. But that this in turn provoked resentment amongst the middle and higher classes at what they perceived as working class opportunism at a time when the burden of military casualties, which these classes felt disproportionately, was increasing. And so therefore I argue that by the end of the war there was a distinct threat that right-wing populism could threaten the political order, and indeed that there was a nascent Durchstoßlegende, a stab in the back idea in British society. Victory in the war is what actually largely cuts off this populist right-wing potentiality. But I would argue that it was certainly there. Now, all of these arguments are nested inside what might be called a meta-argument. This argument was that the understanding of British society during the war has been lost in a series of powerful cultural myths that emerge after the war. So, as I've mentioned, the start of the war becomes shaped around the idea of popular ignorance and, for example, the alleged belief that the war will be over by Christmas, because after the war, this idea of early naivety is taken to be the only possible explanation as to why people got into this stupid war in the first place. Likewise, the move away from volunteerism is regretted due to a nostalgia for an idealised pre-war world, which creates a narrative of oppressive state expansion and control, which removes a lot of the subtlety from the process of actually how this operates within wartime Britain. The religious dimension of the war becomes distorted both by religious figures who had felt guilty about their support for the war and by anti-clerical critics, particularly of the Church of England. The literary image of the complete separation of the combatants from the civilian population became widespread from the period of the war books boom towards the end of the 1920s and start of the 1930s, and it distorts on multiple levels the very real connections between the civilian and combatant populations whilst the war is still going on. And finally, there was the way in which war commemoration, in its emphasis on equality of sacrifice, was covering up the wartime concern with the inequality of sacrifice. And it does so by producing an untrue narrative of universal loss. In other words, the actual and specific bereaved become absorbed in the nation's bereavement, but which now, after 100 years, has created an actually very exaggerated view of the way in which the war impacts every family in Britain. Now, I always feel that it's difficult to get this across to a British audience, but it's worth remembering that in percentage terms, per capita, British casualties of the First World War are half those of France. And yet very few people in Britain find that conceivable, because they always think of this as being an extraordinarily bloody event. Now it is, I'm not saying it isn't, but it's bad enough without exaggerating it still further. All of these myths, I think, are ultimately connected to the mythology of the bad war. The idea that the First World War was characterised by a unique brutality, incompetence and futility. And in the British case, this was shaped above all by the construction of the Second World War as the good war. Because after 1945, the Second World War becomes almost irreproachable in British popular memory, the First World War becomes the war in which all sorts of negative thoughts in a liberal society about war become specifically attached. As a result of this, the motivation that the British had at the time for fighting what many genuinely believed to be the war to end all wars, that motivation has become irretrievably lost. So, that's the story up to my writing the book. But have any of these arguments stood the test of argument and research since then? And have they influenced any subsequent understanding in Britain of the First World War? Well, on one level, my book has made a significant and unexpected impact. The television presenter and journalist Jeremy Paxman drew heavily on my work to shape the general interpretation in his book and BBC One television series Britain's Great War, which was broadcast to quite a large audience in the January of 2014. Paxman's attempt to get behind the accumulated weight of received opinion and to recapture contemporary understandings, very much in line with my work, I think did change the public perception of the war at the start of the centenary year. And as a consultant on the series, I was able, up to a point, to shape parts of the argument. But at the same time, such popular work also led, perhaps inevitably, to oversimplifications. And regrettably, it tended to be Paxman's oversimplifications that dominated public debate and discourse. So, for example, Paxman's very emphatic emphasis on the war as a good and justified cause, and I think not just in terms of the mentalities of those who fought the war, but in some abstract ahistorical sense, went much further than I would have wanted to go. Similarly, just on a small point, his decision in the second episode of the television programme to refer to conscientious objectors as cranks, predictably and perhaps rightly caused a lot of outrage. It was also endlessly frustrating to me that Paxman and his production team were very unwilling to let go of certain stock ideas, and that this on occasion created a certain incoherence in the arguments. For example, a review in The Guardian rightly pointed out that there was an unexplained tension between the way that Paxman had presented that the outbreak of the war had created a lot of shock and despondency, and then moving immediately on to the idea that everybody thought it would be over by Christmas. The reason of that incoherence was that they didn't listen to me saying, can you try not to say that everybody thought it would be over by Christmas, because it's not true. But there we go. Against these gripes, if I'm honest, one should always remember that there is, if we are very truthful with ourselves, little mass audience for most works of academic history, and that to get even a partial version of your ideas to such a mass audience is a rare opportunity. And so I have no regrets. Well, I have some regrets. I mean, I have sometimes suggested that it was a little bit like the situation of the British cabinet in August 1914. You know, I knew the thing was going to happen, and I had to decide whether I wanted to be involved in it or not. And I decided that lesser evil was to be involved, and I think probably that was right, and certainly perhaps more right for me than it was for the British cabinet in August 1914. But of course, for an academic seminar, I should probably say more about academic response. So I'd like to point to 4 works where I feel there has been a real response to my work. The first of these, and probably the most thorough response, is Katrina Pennell's book, A Kingdom United, which was published in 2012. This was based on her doctorate at Trinity College Dublin, and it is a far more exhaustive account of popular responses to the outbreak of war than I was able to do in one chapter of a book. Katrina utilised 441 published and unpublished accounts by contemporary witnesses, 324 of them male, 117 of them female, and indeed including 38 children, and from most parts of the United Kingdom. And she concludes that reactions to the outbreak of the war were complex and ambiguous, that they were not easily reducible to enthusiasm in Great Britain or indifference in Ireland, because she also covers Ireland in this. And by and large, I think I'd argue that Pennell's book represents a massive empirical confirmation of the argument that I made in the last Great War 4 years earlier. So it's one of those nice moments for an academic to say, okay, I thought that this was probably the case, I've got a bit of evidence, I haven't got much time, but here it is. And then somebody goes out and does it properly and demonstrates that your instinct was in fact correct. So that was pleasing. The second book I'd point to is James McDermott's 2011 book on military service tribunals. This developed his doctoral thesis, which was based on the extensive records of the Northamptonshire Appeal Tribunal, which were rediscovered early in the 21st century. McDermott is therefore able to explore in enormous detail the specific operation of conscription in a relatively representative British community. I think Northamptonshire actually covers quite a large segment of British society, and is able to bring out the ways in which voluntary service on the tribunals was paradoxically central to the operation of state compulsion. McDermott also is able to explore, in a very fine, detailed way, the complicated balancing of local needs and the nation state that the tribunals represented. So I think this again builds on and develops work that I had sketched in my book, but has now done it in a much more conclusive way. The third book I would point to is David Munger's study of the National War Aims Committee of 1917 to 1918, which is entitled Patriotism and Propaganda in the First World War, which again was published in 2012. Munger very directly acknowledges the influence of the last Great War in this book, but also independently agrees with many of the arguments in it about how British civilian morale was constructed and sustained. Now, Pennell, McDermott and Munger, none of these were my students, I should point out, although I was aware of their doctoral work while it was being carried out, and indeed I mentioned Katrina's book, a forthcoming PhD in my book, because I did know that she was doing it. But I did supervise Stuart Halifax, who is my fourth example, and I think Stuart has made a series of very interesting contributions, not least his article on the term Over by Christmas for the Journal of First World War Studies, which I think is their most popular article. I think it's the one that's been most referenced. He's also recently published a book on London, remembering 1914 to 18. But I'd say perhaps more significant is actually his extensive blog, greatwarlondon.wordpress.com, where he has been producing an enormous amount of actually tremendously interesting information about the life of the metropolis throughout the First World War. And this is an ongoing project. And I thoroughly recommend it, actually, if you have any interest in Britain and the First World War, because he deals with almost everything. And I think in recapturing the local specificities of war experiences, he is responding to something that I came to believe in the writing of the book, that the next stage of writing about British society in the First World War will probably involve returning to the localities to detail the specific dynamics in which the war was experienced and understood. Okay, so that's where we are now. But what about moving forward? So some methodological points and some self-criticism. There isn't much that I would change if I were to have a second edition of this book, although I think I would be a lot more cautious in my discussion of Scottish military culture after many discussions with my colleague Hugh Strawn. Hugh gets very annoyed with a kind of Scottish jingoism about how much Scotland contributes to the British war effort in the First World War, and he thinks it's based again on some fairly distorted bases. The problem I would have would be not so much, I think, getting rid of any of my existing arguments as working out what I would do with a mass of new material. There is potentially so much new material about Britain and the First World War that's come out in the last few years that I don't think I could produce a second edition without some serious and major reworking. The next big book on British society during the war, and I don't think it will be by me, will need to take on board an explosion of sources. The centenary has brought to light dozens and perhaps hundreds of new accounts, a substantial number of which have never been published before, have now been published either in paper form or electronically. Big electronic source collections produce a series of interesting possibilities for future writing. For example, a lot of what I thought about the rhythm of casualties for local communities could now be re-examined and perhaps challenged using the new database available from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which is much more searchable than anything I had available when I was first writing. Richard Grayson, in his work on military service in Belfast, has demonstrated that the digitisation of service records can revolutionise the understanding of the impact of military recruitment on a given community. And Richard is also pioneering some very interesting big data methods using what might be called family history sources, including buying into commercial ones and then reutilising them in a different way. Even something that took me forever to deal with, and this is actually slightly frustrating, but the digitisation of the military tribunal records for Middlesex by the National Archives provides a wealth of social history information. So somebody who had to sort of exhaustively go through the card indexes and files that they had down in Kew, and now you can just look the stuff straight up online. Similarly, the gathering of First World War material by the Oxford University Computing Service has grown into a massive digital archive project with Europeana 1418. And the existence of online archives of photographs, posters and film represent another transformation. In other words, there is a mass of material available now that wasn't easy to get at. And indeed, local archives are increasingly also digitising material. All of this, I think, genuinely raises the question to whether there's actually a future in writing monographs of this sort. The example of a number of good First World War websites does raise the issue of whether the proper way of dealing with the issue of war experience might in fact be in website form. And again, Stuart's might be an example of what can be done with this. Websites would have all sorts of advantages in terms of the ability to cross-reference themes and can be continually updated in a way that's impossible really for a published book, and even turn into a forum for debate, engaging both the academic scholarly community and the mass of enthusiastic amateurs who work on the history of the First World War in the United Kingdom. I can see a real case for this. But, on the other hand, I am still drawn to the narrative form of the monograph. The unfolding argument, which is underpinned by a storyline which itself unfolds to some degree chronologically. I am, of course, aware that such narration is in many respects a fiction which simplifies the irretrievable messiness of the past. But at the same time, there can be little doubt that these analytical stories, hopefully narrated in good faith and in accordance with a fair view of the evidence, are what we look to in the past. And by we, I conclude here academic historians as well as general readers. Furthermore, and this is a real concern, if we do not narrate these stories, others with far less knowledge and judgment will do it for us, to the detriment, I believe, of public understanding. And it is impossible specifically to be a historian of the First World War in Britain without being acutely aware of this risk. The First World War generates so much bad writing, particularly in the supposedly quality press, where I frequently end up tearing my hair out at things that are, in the academic community, simply known to be untrue, are being repeated over and over again. So finally, where do I think that the British story that I told in the last Great War needs to go next? Well, as I've already suggested, on one level, it does need to be broken down again into its multiple local constituent parts. The war was fought by nation states, or more accurately, by imperial states, but the national experience was usually mediated through the local. I think there will always be a dialectic between local and national history, and I hope we are about to see a new generation of locally based studies. And incidentally, I think this is maybe a very hopeful thing for graduate students, because it's a very good way of having a manageable amount of material to tackle in a doctoral thesis is by doing a really massively in-depth local investigation. So it helps guarantee the future of the field and new people coming forward. But I think the second level is to try and move some of the arguments that I was making in this book beyond Britain. Just as a comparative European historiography helped inform what I was doing in this book, in turn I hope what I was doing in this book can then feed back in to the comparative historiographies. So the second level is to move beyond Britain. Mike Nyberg, in fact, picked up on some of my ideas and went beyond them in his intriguing book about Europe in 1914 to 15, The Dance of the Furies, which was published in 2012. And in it, he argued that the developing perspective that the First World War was not a war sought by the majority of European populations actually helps explain how the war became so savage. It was hatred of the war which was the primary driver of hatred of the enemy. And I think I'm broadly convinced by this contention, not least because I think it sort of feeds off something that I have myself written. Now this in turn I think inevitably raises the issue of war culture. The exhausting debate which was triggered in France by the publication of 14-18, Retrouver la guerre, by Stéphane Audouin-Louzol and Annette Becker, was also, I think, part of the context in which my book was written. I knew Stéphane and Annette through the Historial in Peronne, and I was aware that my own work could be seen in some respects as importing ideas related to their concept of war culture into the British historiography. But I have to say, on the other hand, I have always kept a little bit of distance from what might be called the stronger versions of the war culture thesis. In other words, I dissent from elements of it as well. I think in places it can be quite oversimplified. So what I have done, I think, now is to try to locate the British experience in the more general experience of war. And in entitling my new book, A War of Peoples, I am referencing both the concept of Volkskrieg put forward by Moltke the Elder in 1890 as a nightmare strategic prospect, and the use of the term the People's War by H.G. Wells at the start of August 1914. It is central to this book, which is about the war as a whole, that the fighting of the war rested on popular consent, at least in the sense of acquiescence towards the demands of authority, and that when consent was completely withdrawn, then defeat would swiftly follow. But it should also be noted that there was a reciprocal dimension to this, in that battlefield failure, or indeed political failure, could quickly undermine political legitimacy amongst the population as a whole. And I've tried to sort of walk a tightrope in this book of not seeing the war simply as being driven by the culture of the masses, if you like, but at the same time not seeing the population simply as passive victims of coercion, that there is a dynamic going on here, one of both consent and dissent, and that it continues through the whole war. Now, again, I think I've tried to draw my own work in conjunction with a vast number of other historians of the war into doing this. And in the book, more generally, I think I also wanted to recapture the dynamic between suffering and hope in these populations, and to point out that there were multiple contesting idealisms during the war, both between the combatant powers and within them. And so I think I've now sort of gone back away from Britain into the wider picture, and I think that's where I am for the immediate future in terms of this. And then my hope is in 2018 I can be finished. 2018-2019 I can finally be finished with the war. I can demobilise and return to thinking about other issues in British history. So I do. I'm going to be a war historian for the next few years. And then, and if anybody wants to ask me about what I want to do in British history next, I'm happy to speak about that. But And at that point, I think I have pretty much used up the time that I said I was going to use. So I'm hand over to my respondent and then to someone more generally.